Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Godwin Murunga. So we have two papers, two presenters. The first paper is by Eka, The Role of the State in Post-Conflict Reconstruction Across Space and Time, Insights from the Developmental State Paradigm for Nigeria. And the second paper is Interrogating Local Perceptions of the ICC, Changing Perceptions of Justice, Persisting Insecurities and Local Coping Strategies by Njoki. And so we will proceed in that order. So it's my pleasure to invite Eka to make her presentation. We will give you 15 minutes each.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, thank you very much also to everyone for coming. Thanks also for the presenters that have come before me. I think it's been very enriching to be part of this. I think some people that spoke earlier also have helped me think about some of my ideas for this paper, and I think I'll reference some things people have also said. Let me say what I try to do with this paper is to begin with the premise that we have to challenge this dominant framework of liberal peace building. And to do so, to think about how we may do so, you know, in a way that provides us with real alternatives. And how I try to do that is to draw on empirical experiences from the global South, so thinking about South-South learning, and to draw these experiences from developmental states that have been widely acknowledged as successful developers, and also to consider some African experiences of post-conflict reconstruction in recent history in this light, and then following that reflect upon contemporary post-conflict reconstruction. Now, I speak of Africa, but my reference for the purposes of this presentation mainly Nigeria, actually in two periods. So let me start. I mean, I want to take care to make sure I don't repeat too much of what I said from the session on Monday. But I think some things I will need to go over again. And let me just start by saying that, of course, as many of us know, the dominant interpretation of peace building in the present day is linked very much to the liberal peace thesis. And that's effectively rooted in political and economic liberalization. And as part of that, the way that we think about post-conflict reconstruction really centers on marketization and market-oriented economic policies. And what that means is prioritizing private sector leadership within the economy. It's a lot about talking about small government, fiscal prudence, talking about liberalized trade, so the free movement of goods, never people, free movement of goods. Prioritizing foreign direct investment. And, you know, that can have particular implications because especially where you don't have a sufficiently developed indigenous private sector. Another element of this framework is the prioritization of debt repayments, even in situations where you have very poor development outcomes. So this can be quite problematic. And as part of that, of course, the essential partnerships of key hegemonic institutions, international finance institutions especially, and by that I'm really referring to the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. Now they've been, you know, I think the liberal peace thesis, especially the impact this has on post-conflict reconstruction, has been very widely criticized. And so I'll just highlight a few of these criticisms. One of those is that there's very much a one-size-fits-all approach, one that isn't very cognizant of the particular context that we're talking about and dealing with. Also, there's a criticism that there's a very top-down approach to the way these policies are put in place, And that top-down approach tends to be from the international sphere to the domestic sphere. And that can be very challenging to fledgling democratic processes, because you're thinking about post-conflict a context where many things are being contested, many things are being debated. Another criticism is the disregard for real sectors of the economy. So attached to that is the sense that there's a very short-termist approach to this, an approach that really focuses on stabilization and is not really thinking about long-term developmental goals, thinking about economic transformation, structural transformation, because these are things that are essential for the kind of transformation we should hope for, the kind of socioeconomic transformation we need to be hoping for when we think about the African continent. And I think the final point I will make, and as an especially critical one, is the unproven premise of many of these policy frameworks. You'll be hard-pressed to find any setting where any of these policies have really brought about even the kind of stability that they were supposed to bring about. Now, I'm sure one might ask, why developmental state experiences? I'm sure there are, I imagine there might be other experiences one may want to bring to bear. But my focus on developmental state experiences is especially because in the broader discourse around development, what has happened in developmental states has really challenged this hegemonic way of thinking about development, and that's neoliberal thinking. It's been very successful at doing that. It's been very successful at even challenging the international finance institutions, because the post-Washington consensus, which many of us may know about, has actually been very strongly influenced by the experiences of the developmental states. I mean, that discourse has been led by Professor Joe Stiglitz, and he's variously referenced the experiences of economies like South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan as being very important in guiding his own conclusions around the need to move away from a Washington consensus, to move away from this approach of saying we need to focus on a small government. I mean, it's not to say these policies in and of themselves are problematic. The challenge is the dogmatic approach with which they seem to be imposed on a variety of contexts. So to say a little bit more about the developmental state paradigm, it's often presented as comprising two schools, an economic school and a political school. In terms of the economic school, here the concern is with economic policies that are seen as driving socioeconomic change. So some of these economic policies include industrial policy. So this huge focus on industrialization, this huge focus on structural transformation as being essential to socioeconomic transformation more widely. So there you'll hear about policies like export promotion, like import substitution. So the fact that you protect your economy from the global market to enable your own domestic enterprise, to enable the development of your own domestic industrial sector. So arguments like that. Arguments like the government investing very heavily in the manufacturing sector. Now this is really at odds with neoliberal thinking, which is arguing for a small role for the state, which is arguing that the state should not have a fundamental role to play in the economy. And then you have the political school, which focuses more on the nature and the construct of a state that is able to drive these economic policies. And some of the thinking around that is the notion of a strong state. Thinking around that is also ideas around how that state is governed. Because when we think about developmental states in East Asia, especially over the period that I'm referring to, you find that there are very many militarily ruled governments in place. So some of these debates come to play. Now, this distinction between the economic and political schools highlights the reliance of the developmental state paradigm on a dichotomy between the market and the state. And this has been criticized as being quite problematic. And I agree with that, because it supposes that you can treat the market and the state as so distinct. And treating them in that way actually doesn't deal with the reality that they're very highly interconnected entities whose activities can and very often do impose on one another. Nonetheless, I think this sort of grouping allows me to reflect a little bit on the political school and to think about the way that conflict has been managed in some of these developmental states to a developmental end. So when we think about the conflict experiences of some of these developmental states, I'm focusing on the first year, what are termed first-year developmental states, and that's really Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. And when we think about the conflict experiences of these states, they're quite diverse. So you're talking about Japan's participation in the Sino-Japanese War and Sino-Japanese and Pacific Wars, talking about the Korean Civil War, talking about Taiwan's challenges with mainland China. And I want to reflect very briefly, in the paper I go into more detail about the interplay between these security challenges and developmental outcomes. But for the purposes of time, and because I want to focus quite a bit on Nigeria, I'm afraid I will whiz through this, but if you have questions, probably we can pick that up in the Q&A. So when we think about South Korea, one finds that post-war recovery was really engineered by the building of a strong and centralized state that focused very much on large-scale industrialization, starting in low technology sectors like textiles and moving on to high technology sectors like steel production and chemicals as well. And such a state was able to select and enable particular sectors and particular firms that have led to what many now know as the chaebols, your Samsung, Hyundai, many of these companies that we're all very familiar with now. And that's not to say that there have not been errors that the state has made on the way, because quite often, we only hear the story of the success. Nonetheless, all of this happens, and it's quite interesting. I think it's very important to reflect on these settings, because, when we think about conflict situations in many parts of Africa, it's very difficult to conceive of this kind of socioeconomic transformation in that, alongside that conflict or following that conflict. So thinking about Taiwan, one can reflect on how the nationalist Taiwanese state really saw industrialization as a survival mechanism, because there it had mainland China really on its borders. So we had to think very seriously about its own survival. And so security actually becomes a motivator for advancement in this way. So you saw the Taiwanese state undergo a self-imposed discipline that saw it try to fight corruption and focus on a fiscal and monetary policy conservatism that would enable it drive its developmental agenda. You also saw a Taiwanese state that utilized US foreign aid to drive this industrialization process by enabling an agricultural sector that was then able to contribute to industrialization. And here it raises the question about the use of foreign aid, because we hear a lot about conditionalities, we hear a lot about the challenge, if you're not paying for it, how do you deal with that? And here, I think there are examples that one can draw upon in that light. You think about Japan, and for Japan, the role of its bureaucracy, is world famous, really, and in particular, its Ministry for International Trade and Industry. And that was really at the heart of its industrial transformation agenda. And in fact, its security challenges were very essential to the strengthening of that ministry in particular, because there's a recognition that Japan was almost on its own, and a recognition that we need to power this industrialization by ourselves, and also focusing on our region, right? So there you see, how insecurity, if you like, was used to channel this kind of developmental agenda. Now, I must acknowledge that citing these experiences in a very in a particular space, I'm talking about East Asia, and in a particular time in Japan, we're talking about the 30s, the 40s, South Korea and Taiwan, we're talking about the late 50s, no, actually the 60s, into the 70s, and the period of very rapid economic growth that has really defined this region. We're talking about from the 60s to the 80s, from the 60s to the 80s. So one can ask, what is the point of reflecting on that? But I think in the spirit of South-South learning, there's a lot of analytical value that can come out of this, and especially that can help us reflect on earlier periods, for me, especially the post-colonial period in Africa. And let me come very quickly to Nigeria. So for Nigeria, I want to begin with the period of post-conflict reconstruction after the Biafran War. And in Nigeria, one finds that its socioeconomic transformation agenda with its second development plan between 1970 and 1974, took a similar line to what I've just reflected upon within the developmental states. And for Nigeria, central to this, and it's a point that's been raised earlier, was its control of the expanding financial base. So as part of that, there was a policy, a nationalization policy, that saw the Nigerian state actually, the question with Barney and Dr. Cyril Obi around the ownership of oil resources, because this is a period that saw the Nigerian state actually nationalize oil companies to ensure that it owned those companies, it owned 60% of those companies, and that is the situation that remains in place to date. And with that financial backing, the Nigerian state was able to act as a surrogate capitalist to enable development. So you saw a Nigerian state actually investing directly in industrialization. You also saw a Nigerian state that recognized the need for an indigenous private sector that was, and that was carried out through a very extensive indigenization policy. And as part of the post-war efforts, you saw that indigenization policy, there were further amendments to it that tried to limit individual Nigerian participation in that indigenization policy, so that individual Nigerians couldn't own entire companies. They had to limit how much they owned in a company to 5% and things like that. So a kind of socialization policy. You saw, industrial production that was also stimulated because of the import restrictions that the Civil War had brought about. And, if you like, the proof is in the pudding, because that period has seen the highest levels of manufacturing value added that Nigeria has ever had. You saw manufacturing value added at 9% of GDP. Even now, when we talk about Nigeria as the largest economy in Africa, 26th largest economy in the world, the highest level of GDP was in 2013 at 6.83%. Many of the infrastructural investments that are still in place to date from that period. There's been very little that happened after that to a similar degree. You saw social infrastructural projects, investments in education, investments in a very extensive federal government secondary level education system that was also part of a post-conflict reconstruction effort. I'm talking about the unity schools. You saw efforts in the National Youth Service Corps that was about reconstruction, about reconciliation. Very heavy investments here that were really thinking about longer term agendas. Now, let me whiz very quickly to the current day. This has been, the two conflicts I want to speak about in this current dispensation of liberal peace building, the Niger Delta conflict. For the purposes of time, I won't go into that background, but fortunately, Dr. Cyril Obi, I'll just be repeating all the things he's written, and he spoke about that earlier. But let me focus on the attempt at post-conflict reconstruction following that conflict. The main program that was put in place has been a disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration program with an amnesty program at its center. That program to date has been allocated public funding of 324 billion naira between 2009 and 2014. In dollar terms, that's about $2.1 billion has been allocated to that. Now, in a detailed critique of this amnesty program, work by Vanessa Oshie, she makes the point that this initiative has failed to address the root causes of the underlying issues that led to the conflict because of its piecemeal individualistic focus that has really focused on monetary payments to the militants. That is the reconstruction effort. I think Dr. Obi also mentioned earlier, and she does as well, that in fact these resources, what they've been successful at doing is redistributing political power, influence, and patronage. So what you see here is a production of rent that is not at all linked to productive capacity. So it's not at all linked to a broader socioeconomic development agenda. And she also highlights a very important point, that thinking of all the resources that have been put to this, a wasted opportunity for redistributed investments in infrastructure and social amenities in key public goods, like we saw in the earlier period. Sorry. Let me go very rapidly to, we're not yet at the post-conflict situation, thinking about Boko Haram, that people have referenced here as well. I think many of us know about the conflict, so I won't go into detail there. It's early to talk about post-conflict reconstruction there, but already one can reflect on the response that has come from the Nigerian state to this conflict. Really, the response has been military action. But following, what we all know now, the kidnapping of schoolgirls in April of this year, there has been a lot more being said. I mean, I know many people have been saying this from the start, many people at the ALC here, talking about the need to have a more comprehensive engagement with this crisis. There's been more said about a developmental agenda to addressing the Boko Haram challenge. And we hear that Nigeria and Africa's richest man, Aliko Dangote, is promising to invest in northern Nigeria. You hear the World Bank also offering to invest. But a lot of those investments are really focusing on large-scale infrastructure, are really abstracting from those that are most affected by these challenges. And again, you see a delinking between addressing that challenge and a broader developmental agenda. And I think really this is the reality of a global development policy environment that has moved away from thinking about these things on a long-term basis, but rather to a choppy, project-based approach. That really characterized the structural adjustment period. I think also, just to wrap up very rapidly, to say that from this, I hope it's possible to see that we can reflect historically on geographical context in the global south and post-colonial Africa for possible ideas that will help us challenge this dominance of the liberal peace-building agenda. And I don't want to give the suggestion that Africans are helpless to addressing this, because that's not true. I think, I will side with Professor Adedeji, the founding executive secretary of UNECA, who has argued that the Nigerian elite actually have a lot more or the African elite have a lot more to answer for the situation that we find ourselves in than international actors. And that's very true when we think of the place of the transnational capitalist class across Africa today. And by that, I speak of people in Nigeria itself, like the current finance minister, who's a World Bank veteran, the agriculture minister himself, who is very well known in the global spaces, and to ask whose agenda they're driving and why they're driving that agenda. And I think we're at a very critical time where it is possible to challenge these approaches very successfully for 4 reasons that I will just state, 4 points. First of all, the neoliberally driven system that we're currently within is in crisis. Even the developed world is aware of this, and this is very clear when we think of how they've responded to recent financial crises. I think also the African economies are also, in spite of what I said, enjoying a particular renaissance at the present moment. Thinking about the rise of a number of African countries to middle-income status. I think there's also a shift in the center of gravity when we think of the rise of emerging economies across the world, and that there is space for a strong African voice there. And I think also we're approaching the end of an MDGs period when there's very little to show for that when we think about Africa. Sorry for going over my time, but I'll leave it.
It's now my pleasure to invite Njoki Wamae to interrogate local perceptions of the ICC. Njoki, you have 15 minutes, please.
Thank you. My paper draws on my research, my PhD research. So feedback is very welcome. We have quite distinguished scholars from the continent. So it's still a lot of work in it. All these are, I just finished my fieldwork about 2 months ago, and I think I'm going to, in the next few weeks, I'm still going to do a bit of it. So it's quite a lot of preliminary thoughts on what I'm finding. And my research project, its title was Local Perceptions of the ICC, and I'm glad that Cyril raised the problem with the local. It's something I've also been thinking about, and maybe it's something I need to think, rethink of how I want to restructure. But again, so when I thought about the local, when I was starting the research, it was three counties in Kenya. That's Uasin Gishu, Nakuru, where the 2 cases of the ICC. So the 2 cases we have of the International Criminal Court is Uhuru Kenyatta versus, or is it OTP versus Uhuru Kenyatta, the president, and OTP versus William Ruto, the deputy president, and Arap Sang, the radio journalist. And these 2 cases, the victims of the case are based in Uasin Gishu and Nakuru County. So I thought if I focus on this, I would what would emerge, I would get probably sharper findings because it's an everyday reality. So the research was conducted between September 2013 to April 2014, and I'm back for a few weeks. So maybe I'll start with the introduction. On March 30, 2013, the Supreme Court of Kenya declared Uhuru Kenyatta of the Jubilee Coalition the fourth president of Kenya after closely contested election between him and his closest contender, Raila Odinga, of the Coalition for Reforms and Democracy. Earlier in December 2010, the International Criminal Court had charged President Kenyatta with crimes against humanity for alleged roles in orchestrating ethnic violence during the 2007 elections in Kenya. Ruto, a Kalenjin, is accused of organizing post-election violence against Kenyatta's people, who is a Kikuyu, in the Rift Valley, contributing to the national death rate at that toll at that time, which was, according to government sources, 1,133, and displacement of more than 650,000 people. Despite consistent reminders by local, regional, international actors on the diplomatic, political, and economic challenges likely to face Kenya in case of a Jubilee coalition win, due to the ICC's charges on the coalition's leadership, their supporters, who are mainly drawn from their ethnic groups, voted for them overwhelmingly. More confounding was how the ICC seemed to inadvertently galvanize votes for a Kenyatta and Ruto win, particularly from those ostensibly most in need of the ICC's assistance in ending impunity, such as the victims and survivors of the 2007 post-election violence. Indeed, Kenyans had consistently expressed support for the ICC as late as October 2012. This occurrence still demonstrates a puzzling scenario that raises questions on how international level justice processes, such as the ICC, are perceived at the local level. Again, local, I'm looking at ordinary Kenyans in those 3 counties, and to the Wanjiku, who is like the metaphorical symbol of the local Kenyan in the Kenyan socio-political discourse, and how these perceptions and understanding influence the success of the ICC justice project. At a time when the International Criminal Court is under criticism, especially by African governments for its alleged lack of legitimacy, the Kenyan case is timely in providing evidence on how international justice processes are perceived by those most affected by violence. So in this paper, I think I will use those affected by violence and local interchangeably. This study is especially interested, the study was especially interested in the dilemmas of justice faced by those most affected by the 2007 violence, who, according to the international and national civil society actors, stand to benefit most from the promise of international justice embodied by the ICC. Methodologically, this study employed an emic or interpretivist approach to understand these local perceptions. And of course, the resulting methods were more of anthropological methods, a lot of participant observation and immersion to understand the meanings of ordinary citizens, which they ascribe to the ICC. So on the surface, so the WIN presented a number of issues which I interrogated. So some of the questions were, how is the ICC perceived by people affected by violence in the three Kenyan counties where the victims are based? Are these perceptions different from the elite narratives at the national level, ruling elite? How do victims and survivors of the post-election violence perceive justice? How do these same people perceive peace and reconciliation? And to what extent are the aspirations for peace attained? And then what are the sources of insecurity among those affected by violence? And how does it relate to the government narratives of the same? So that's basically the background. So my argument that's the major project, but for this paper and maybe the upcoming publication, I focused at the last question about insecurities. So at the preliminary level of analysis, the findings seem to indicate that perceptions about the ICC are not static or monolithic. From these findings, the paper argues that end users or those people at the local level of the ICC's programs at the local level exercise their agency by appropriating elite-driven narratives of peace, justice, and we have moved on. That's the main government narrative of moved on. So even those people at the local level, on the surface, those are the same narratives. What Uhuru and Ruto are saying, that's the same thing they're saying on the surface. But if you dig deeper or through the research, I found that they exercise their agency by appropriating these narratives to advance their socioeconomic aspirations within the existing peaceful period, resulting from the, of course, peaceful between the elite pact between Kenyatta and Ruto. However, despite this confluence of the national elite-driven peace narratives, with an equal aversion to ICC justice with those at the local level, contradictions exist. And these are the focus, this is what this paper will focus on. And these contradictions come when they talk about what about their insecurities. And then their coping strategies further show that it is not as it looks. So despite the prevailing narratives of moving on with peace, because they all say we've moved on, forget about the ICC or forget about justice, failure to address previous insecurities that were the root causes of the post-election violence, such as the contested land tenure in the Rift Valley, has inadvertently led to the emerging security transformations in these societies that need to be considered. These transformations include land zoning along ethnic lines, secondly, increased cultural and ethic consciousness, and thirdly, an emerging Rift Valley identity in Nakuru and Uasin Gishu. These emerging contradictions observed are the security transformation and the coping strategies which they have developed are what I look at as security transformations. I will not focus more on the background, probably go directly to explaining what I found in these three. So on how they perceive justice and peace. Perceptions of justice from participants interviewed, again, they are not static. They are constantly changing because if you interviewed them at some time before the Uhuru and Ruto came together, they would say, oh, we want justice, ICC justice. And I would ask them, what has changed? And they would say, of course, things have changed. And Ruto and Uhuru are the president. And even now, I hope that we can, with the new there's a disconnect going on, like in Uasin Gishu. Other perceptions of justice could be emerging. So emerging security transformations. With the government keen to move on without addressing the root causes of violence, communities have developed their coping strategies, which I have talked about: increased geographical zoning along ethnic lines, and a new wave of ethnic cultural consciousness, visible through the many informal elders meetings with discussions on how to secure their future. And thirdly, also embracing the Rift Valley as their home. This is especially Kikuyus, who are considered as outsiders, and finding ways to coexist peacefully. So if you look at land zoning along ethnic lines, land zoning along it has been observed in Nakuru County and Uasin Gishu County, so the two places that I did the fieldwork. In Nakuru County, for instance, Kikuyus have settled in the Lanet area since the violence, after 2008, and there's increased purchase of land in the area. Increased purchase of land in the area is taking an ethnic pattern. So while another place called Ngata area, Ngata Farm, is mostly purchased by Kalenjins. When I interviewed residents who had bought land in Lanet and Ngata about the new land purchasing patterns, they alluded to the need to purchase land among your people, especially after the post-election violence. So Rongai sub-county, which is also a sub-county within Nakuru County, where people of different ethnic groups used to live there before 2008, is now considered a Kalenjin area, as one person told me, and I quote, "This time, we cannot risk buying land anywhere because it is fertile. You have to buy land in a Kikuyu zone if you're Kikuyu, Kalenjin zone if you're Kalenjin, Luo zone if you're Luo." You know, in Pipeline, Luo Pipeline is one of the places in Nakuru. Luos are buying land on one side and Kikuyus on another. There is also a Kisi zone, which is not such a problem. Nakuru town belongs to everyone. We have to protect ourselves from what happened during the post-election violence by living with our people. So that's a Kikuyu businessman I interviewed in November. So I also observed land zoning phenomena in Uasin Gishu County. A Kikuyu farmer in Wendani area led his fellow Kikuyu neighbors to the Keses near Moi University, Keses police station, to protest what he called coercion and threats to sell their land by a local Kalenjin leader. Yet he had been born in the land he lived in. So when I interviewed him, again, I quote, he said, "I left the IDP camp and went to my shamba. My shamba is land for 2 years ago. Now we've been asked to move out by the Kalenjin neighbors through their leader. This is just political peace. As you can see, we have been forcefully evicted." So, this person I interviewed, they have gone on to form like land buying companies to rebuy the land. So, additionally, a number of informal land buying groups among the Kikuyus have emerged in Uasin Gishu to counter these forced buyouts from the Kalenjin. As one participant told me, "This is our home and we are here to stay. We will be buying land from our people," that is Kikuyus, "so that we are not wiped out of this place at this rate." So I know I'm running a rate. So you can see there's a new pattern, and this I consider as a security transformation in how, despite those national narratives of peace and moving on by the elites, insecurity, people at that local level are very aware of the insecurities that exist because the land issue has not been dealt with, and they're using their own coping strategies to buy out land, to force to get like a zone. So since the government has failed to address the contested land issue in the Rift Valley adequately, ordinary Kenyans at the local level have taken action by ejecting outsiders in Uasin Gishu, and it's not forcefully. You can see they're using all this land buying and buying out land from their community members before rival ethnic groups purchase the land to create ethnically homogeneous zones which offer communal security in the case of violence. The second one I said was cultural revival and ethnic conscientization. I'll just breeze through and say that I observed an increased, there's all, especially among Kikuyus again in Nakuru and Uasin Gishu, there's a lot of meetings of, let us come back, let's go back to our roots. So there are several types of those meetings geared, and they're still going on, geared towards ethnic consciousness, though they use also peace. These are peace meetings, So on one hand, by calling on ethnic consciousness and return to cultural values and ways, there is a possibility that positive values of peaceful coexistence, such as respect, could, according to some of them, could lead to sustainable peace. Again, on the other hand, ethnic consciousness could have negative effects on peace and human security. Preliminary evidence from observation and interviews indicates that these meetings where they are calling from, you know, like one person who told me, the reason we Kikuyus have been constantly attacked is that while other communities are so culturally aware of themselves, we are busy making money. We have to now decide to mentor our young men to embrace our traditions, because when you know yourself, you're strong, and the enemy will fear you. So you can see, it's still out there, but cultural revival, it can be both ways. So, and it's also another way you can say that they're dealing with these insecurities and finding their own ways towards creating coping strategies and transforming security. Again, we don't know how it will end. Then the third one was towards the Rift Valley identity. So on a positive note, security transformation seem to be can lead to more cohesiveness, and it seems to be emerging, especially again among those Kikuyus I interviewed. A number of diaspora Kikuyu, they seem to come to the realization that continued support of presidential Kikuyu candidates from Central Province, that is like Kenyatta and the other, Kenyatta, Kibaki, they all come from Central, and Kenyatta the father, that their continued support for presidential Kikuyu candidates from Central Province is to their detriment, and they have resolved to support. Of course, this resolving is not, it's a couple of those people who are going for those meetings that are interviewed. But we can only know in another election, but this is what they have said, to support candidates from the Rift Valley as a practice. So maybe this could discourage ethnicized politics in the future. We can only test, of course, in 2017. And there's someone who told me, it seems our vote doesn't count as diaspora Kikuyu. So we are holding these meetings to encourage our people to embrace and respect our neighbors and host here in the Rift Valley. From the last meeting, we agreed we will be voting with our brothers. Of course, not brothers, not like women exist anyway, here in the Rift as a community, and not to the Kikuyus in Central who don't really care about us. So that continued feeling of exclusion among diaspora Kikuyu by those in the homeland may increase indifference to ethnic affiliation among those in the Rift Valley, and eventually lead to security transformations where they would partner with their neighboring communities in the Rift Valley. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Njoki. Thank you very much, Ake. I will not use the powers of the chair to be the first one to make comments. Let me be magnanimous in that way. So I will open the discussion to questions and concerns, and if there will be time, I will do so. No. Oh, there is a discussion. Oh, yes. Yes, please. James. The other paper, it was decided to be tabled to be considered for publication, but it will not be presented. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's been like earlier on a very enriching period with two presentations that actually help us again to look at this issue of security from two different angles that are, or should I say three different angles that are not unrelated. Now, the first thing I actually want to point to is definitely this relationship between the three papers that we have had during this period. The key relationship that I have found between them is that there is a lot of emphasis still on this idea of the neglect of local realities, or the neglect of society in efforts to actually address security problems. Starting with the first paper now, the presentation actually made clear why the liberal peace approach may not be suitable or has not been considered suitable when addressing these issues in the African context. And there is the presenter, Dr. Eka, actually has some leaning for the developmental peace approach. That is understood from the way the paper was presented, but I think on that particular paper there are two key issues that that I would like to raise, perhaps for consideration by the presenter, but also perhaps for the audience to actually interact around. The first one is that the criticism of the liberal, one of the criticisms of the liberal peace approach that she raised was that it was a one-size-fits-all approach. Now, I do not understand if she doesn't also consider the developmental peace approach to be a one-size-fits-all approach. The second one is that the liberal peace approach was criticized because it's, or rather, is the criticism of the liberal peace approach based on the fact that it failed after being implemented, or is it based on the fact that it was rejected by the countries that were supposed to actually try, or on which it was expected to be tried? So those are the things that I feel, to me, are hanging as far as that presentation is. I would really be happy to have some light shed on those. The second presentation looks at the issues around justice and security, and she was really interested in bringing out the transformations in security in the post-conflict period in Kenya. Now, that paper definitely also underscored the importance of local realities when addressing security issues. But where I would like to actually focus is the issues that I think are important as far as improving it is concerned to me. The first is that I think very little was done to clarify the notion of justice that she has in that paper. And the question I ask precisely is justice synonymous to the ICC? Or in another way, what is your definition of justice? It's the same question put in two different ways. So because if it's clear what you understand justice to be, then I think it would be more comprehensible. Now, the second and last is what has been the impact of the changes in perceptions of security, the changes in the perceptions of justice on security. I expected to actually see you make that connection. Now, the last paper that actually looks at anti-refugee violence, mapping the terrain and proffering an explanation, equally pays some attention to the role of society in formulation and implementation of decisions. And what is striking about this is that when you have a situation where, talking particularly about refugees, reactions to refugees within countries, when you have a situation where locals are taken into consideration, or local perceptions are taken into consideration, then refugee problems can be handled in a very constructive way. And the paper actually does this by looking at the situation in the DRC and the situation in Uganda. And in the case of Uganda, it is seen that the government tried to actually get refugees out of that country, but that it faced a lot of opposition from the local population, and that this was actually due to the failure of the government to understand what was going on, or to take into consideration what was going on within the different communities where these local refugees were actually found. So I think the three papers are very, very enriching as far as the discussion on security and society is concerned. And to sum it all, the emphasis again has been on taking into consideration the role of society in the decision-making process on matters of security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kiven. And so now we open it up to the rest of us. Any questions, comments? And I will really request that you be as precise as possible in the interest of time so that we can recover what we lost in the morning. 1, 2, 3 at the back, and 4 here.
My name is Desmond Davis. I'm a journalist and a mentor on the ALC program. It's to do with the ICC because I've been covering the ICC since 1998. And the question Njoki should look at really is, what is ICC justice? There are really two major constraints to ICC justice, and that's funding and the Dutch government. Since Fatou Bensouda took over, funding has been reducing constantly. And because of that, the Office of the Prosecutor cannot function. Secondly, the Office of the Prosecutor cannot get visas for witnesses to attend the court. And that is a major problem, because if you want to deal with the case of Sudan, all the witnesses are going to come from refugee camps in Chad. And if you take them to The Hague, they're going to ask for political asylum. And under the Rome Statute, the ICC is bound to give them asylum, and the Dutch government is not willing to give asylum. So in the case of Kenya, if I were lawyers representing the accused, I'll go to the court and say, yes, I'm ready to start the case, but I've got 1,000 witnesses. And the court is not going to say, I'm not going to allow you to have 1,000 witnesses because you're talking about ICC justice. Now, when you go to the Dutch government and say, well, I need visas for 1,000 Kenyans, will the Dutch government give visas to 1,000 Kenyans? The Dutch government would not. So then if I were the ICC, the lawyers for Ruto and Kenyatta, I go back to the court and say, well, we cannot get our witnesses here. We want the case struck off. And that's the end of the story. So what is ICC justice? I think you should look more into these intricacies of the whole thing rather than just concentrate on what the locals are saying.
Yeah.
I would like to thank both presenters. I think very good. Godwin, it's actually to you that I want to address my first request of the question. That is for a circulation of the papers at some point. Because I think, for instance, what Eka has done in her paper can be very important for me in my paper, especially around the liberal peace thing. And how is it that South Africa is conceptualizing its involvement? So we really need to, as quickly as possible, have a kind of a circulation of these, if you don't mind. So thank you very much. Lots of ideas. Njoki, I'm not sure here because the time is so limited and you don't really get time to get into your paper. But I was wondering whether you should perhaps consider a slight change to your title, because what it seems to me you're actually doing is to show these responses and perceptions beyond the ICC almost. It's almost, what do people do while this whole ICC thing is in the background and no one really knows where it's going to? what happens at the local level. So it's almost as if the title is slightly misleading. And then there's this fascinating information that you're bringing out. But your title is not really bringing one to what it is that you're telling us about. I almost want to say coping strategies in people's heads around their own security, in what they may see as the absence of justice coming from somewhere else. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I did enjoy both presentations, and Dr. Eka made some insightful inputs on Nigeria. But I was wondering if she could let me understand the link between the Niger Delta problems and the Boko Haram disturbances. She was trying to make some connection, but I really didn't get it as clearly as possible. On Njoki, I'm wondering if the selection of her respondents was very representative. I'm just making a conjecture. I'm just assuming it wasn't. Can you please tell me how you were able to get your respondents to respond to your questions? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to the two presenters. My questions are directed towards Njoki. It's quite fascinating and interesting listening to you because in the last month or thereabout, I have been all through the Rift Valley on some of the things we've talked about, and I could speak to some of them directly. Permit me that I'm still new to studying and understanding the ethnic, political, and security dynamics of Kenya, so I might sound to be a novice in that respect. But I wanted to raise 3 key issues. Issue number 1, I wanted you to reflect on, perhaps maybe because of time you couldn't get into that, on the historical dimensions of issues around justice and post-conflict reconciliation in Kenya. To go back a little bit, given that post-election violence is not new in Kenya, the 2007 episode was not the first time. You had it in 1992, you had it in 1997, and also you've also had similar kind of violence but related to issues around land in 2004, 2006. Why I said this is, I think something that came up in the last 2 days was the issue of memory and imagination. And I think something that has also come up in Eka's presentation is, as Africans, what can we learn from previous episodes of certain social phenomenon, how those issues were resolved or they were dealt with. So in the case of Kenya, what were the lessons that were learned in relation to issues of justice, issues of post-conflict reconciliation in previous episodes of post-election violence, and how does that differ or connect with the realities of post-2007 post-election violence, and especially the internationalization of the demand for justice and post-conflict reconciliation? That is number 1. Number 2 is also to invite you as well to say something about the concept of ethnicity. I think there is an assumption, I might be wrong, about ethnicity and ethnic identities being a monolith in this context in Kenya. My experience of being in the Rift Valley for about 3 weeks, going to different communities, is that it's not a straightforward issue. Ethnic identities in Kenya is very fluid. Even Kalenjis. Kalenjis is not a monolith. There are at least about 5 or 6 subgroups of Kalenjis. And it's not often the case of Kalenji versus Kikuyu, or Kikuyu versus Luo, or Luo versus Luya. Sometimes it is Kalenji versus Kalenji. And what you find, personally I went to communities in Rongai constituency, places like Banita, places like East Mao, places like Likia, places like Muindabi. And the reality in some of these places, current scenario, is that even on land, you find Kikuyus, Kalenji groups or subgroups, Luos, Luyas, coming together against fellow Luos, against fellow Kalenjis, against fellow Luyas, largely because of the issue of land. It is more often a case of landowners or people who call natives who were there before versus squatters or people who have been given fresh allocation by the government under a resettlement plan. So that is not reflected in that. And the whole notion of ethnic land zoning, whereby residency patterns are beginning to take ethnic dimension. I think that raises a very important issue, which, not just for your presentation, but I also think in the context of this conference in the last 3 days, about the psychological dimensions of security issues in Africa, which is not something that has been captured.
About what led to the economic development boom in both South Korea and Taiwan. And that is key, I think, to what they were able to achieve economically. And that is the American umbrella. It saved them a lot of headaches, a lot of spending on security and the military that other countries did not have the luxury of. And it provided them, more importantly, an open market for their product. And that counts a great deal in their success. So sometimes I hear this nonsense, well, in 1956, Ghana was at the same level as South Korea. So they do not take into consideration this critical aspect of why these two countries, Taiwan and South Korea, were able to emerge so rapidly. Yes, the elites made some good choices, but again, the context in which they did it mattered a great deal.
Thank you very much. Before I call upon the two presenters to make their comments, I have just 2 comments to make. And I think Professor Ndiaye has taken my point that I was going to make. Dr. Eke, there is something called the hegemonic stability theory, which Professor is talking about, that you cannot explain the development of Korea, South Korea, you cannot explain the development of Japan without taking into account the role that the US played in terms of providing stability, security in that area, and in terms of providing a market for their products and providing a lot of input into the developmental process. So the hegemonic stability theory is critical to explaining the so-called developmental state in East Asia. For Njoki, the idea of the ICC and its justice, in the case of Kenya, in my view, the justice process of the ICC seems to favor the accused more than the victims. You cannot look at what happened with regard to the pre-trial chamber. You do not decide that these 2, 3, 4, 5 people have a case to answer, but we shall prosecute them after 1 year. So they go back home. They will come back 1 year or 2 years down the road. In the interim period, those who will provide evidence are eliminated. So does the ICC really have any justice to dispense in that regard? Anyone who would want to go first? Okay.
Let me say thank you very much for these very rich comments. They'll go a long way to help me as I continue to develop the paper. First, let me respond to my discussion. Thanks very much for those. I'll start with the second question you asked. I think it's probably more straightforward. I meant that when I spoke about the failure of the liberal peace building thesis, liberal peace thesis, I was talking about situations where this has been applied and it failed. I think before I'd referenced Afghanistan, I'd referenced East Timor, and some elements of the interpretation of what has happened in Sierra Leone, but even focusing on Nigeria, I think my point is that actually when we reflect on the Niger Delta and the way that, when I speak of this amnesty program, when I say this is done, if you like, borrowing from the peace building thesis, I mean the individualistic approach. And I will say that, okay, one can speak to some semblance, a semblance of stability over this period, but already we hear rumblings of trouble ahead of the 2015 elections. The fact that, you know, this reconstruction, post-conflict reconstruction policy has actually served to redistribute rents that are being used to facilitate political contestations. I think we're going to be hearing a lot more about that as we approach 2015. I think some people might have seen videos of Asari Dokubo threatening all. Asari Dokubo is a main, a major, member, I guess, of this Niger Delta group of militants, promising all kinds of hell if Jonathan Goodluck does not win those elections again. So, I don't know what kind of stability we call that. So that's the point I was making there. On your first point and I do take that point about criticizing the criticizing liberal peace building as being about a one-size-fits-all agenda, and what am I saying about the developmental state approach? Let me say that I think it is impossible for us to think about socioeconomic transformation without that being grounded in a long-term developmental agenda, without the centrality of structural transformation and socioeconomic transformation in Africa. So, because I think historically it has never happened that you have that kind of socioeconomic transformation without those things. So if that is treating it as a one-size-fits-all, then I am guilty, because I don't think we can think about a change or transformation on our continent without thinking about those things very seriously. Having said that, I don't think, even when we think about developmental states, the way that they've responded to things, and the way even when I speak about Nigeria, the way Nigeria responded to its own circumstances in the post-colonial period, I think we're different, and they were responding to very particular challenges. I think, for instance, think of South Korea and Taiwan. A major factor, and I hear the point that has been made about the cover of the US, if you like, but a major factor has been their Japanese colonial experience, and that's had a huge impact on their own success. So that also colors the way that they've dealt with their, post-conflict situation. I think if you think what I said about Nigeria, this focus on building an indigenous private capital class has been something quite specific, something that Nigeria focused on, and that speaks to something that's a contextual issue. I think South Korea has actually been criticized for not having done enough of that. So I think it is different, and I think also reflecting, and this is probably a conceptual issue when you're trying to, build a concept from an empirical basis. But I think the richness of that is it allows us to reflect on different contexts and to think about how we can theory build from different contexts in a very rich way. And I think it allows us to do that. Clement's point on connecting the Niger Delta and Boko Haram, I guess my point was trying to connect them in terms of how they're very focused on an individualistic approach. The responses to these situations are very focused on an individualistic approach, are very delinked from a broader developmental agenda in a way that's different to what had happened before. That's the connection I was trying to draw there. I think for the Boko Haram situation, it's very early to say. We're not even in a period of real, a post-conflict situation, if you like. But I think some things are telling, and something that appears anecdotal, but I think is not, is when you think there's an interview with the finance minister during the World Economic Forum, where somebody tried to speak, an American journalist, I think, or someone from an American, news, whatever, company, tried to speak with her about the Boko Haram crisis. This was shortly after the kidnapping of over 200 girls from a secondary school in Borno State. And she, first of all, this interview started off, she was a bit, thrown, and said she's actually quite tired of speaking about all of this. That we're here at the World Economic Forum, and people keep talking about this. And that, in fact, Nigeria is holding the first the first Africa World Economic Forum on the continent, and it's been very successful because everyone came to discuss the future of Africa, and in fact, the fact that that meeting was held was a triumph over terrorism, in spite of the fact that we were 3 weeks into the kidnapping of the girls. I mean, now we're over 2 months into that period, and we're no closer to a solution than at that time. And I think that's very telling. The idea that these are separate things, that the economy carries on, stop distracting us with this issue. It's got nothing to do with that. And another way of reflecting on the Niger Delta situation is, I guess the Nigerian state couldn't get away with such an approach, because actually the conflict in the Niger Delta challenged the very base of, it's very resource-based. I mean, Nigerian economy in 2010, public revenue to the state comes from, the majority of that comes from the oil sector. It was at 74% in 2010. So there's no way you can go around that. You have to respond to that. You can't treat these as different things. But my sense is if they could treat the Niger Delta situation as separate, that's what would have happened. And I think that's quite different to what had happened in the past. It may also be the nature of the conflict, On this cover of the US, and I guess the bigger issue is the extent to which one can really genuinely draw on what has happened in East Asia and reflect on that and think if that provides any insights at all to situations in Africa. And I take all those factors on board, that and many other factors. So it's the cover of the US, but there are many other things. There's the fact that actually we're talking about a very different age in terms of how we think about development. It was a period in the post-Second World War. There was, a lot of acceptance of the fact that the state has to play a central role in development, even in the developed world. So it's different in many ways. Nonetheless, I think there's a lot we can take from that. Because there might have been that cover, but some may argue, for instance, that the WTO provides some cover for developing economies today that is not being fully utilized. Some may argue that regional groupings could provide that cover. So we can force a similar cover, if we're able to get our act together. Because I think another cover, in fact, when we think of East Asia, was Japan. Was the fact that you did have this, if you like, senior among this group, as something quite particular. And you had Japan actually steering many of these other economies. Because we do talk about South Korea and Taiwan, but the reality is that their colonial experience, it's difficult to speak of benefits of a colonial experience, but what they got from their colonial experience differs very much from what many African countries got from their colonial experiences. And so those things create some level of imbalance. But I think in spite of that, there are still things we can draw from what happened in East Asia. And it's not to say that we have to emulate them, because we can't. It's a different age than many of these factors you've made. But there are things they did that we, I think many countries on the continent can draw from, bearing in mind the difference in context. There are still policy frameworks that, make a lot of sense. The infant industry protection agenda, the focus on industrialization. These are things that if we don't, even in the even in the developed or in the global north, these are things that work for their own development progress as well. Yeah, I hope that addresses that.
Thank you very much for all your feedback. It's very useful. I will start with Dr. Kewir, the discussant. You asked that I should clarify my notion of justice, and yes, I have done that eventually I will do that, and I've done that even during the proposal stage of the research. And I look at different notions of justice and the dilemmas of justice, whether it's retributive, restorative, and socioeconomic. There are many different dilemmas. But because this research it's more from an emic perspective, or like grounded theory, so it's more like I had to go to the field and hear what people are saying and then take now that, and now that's when I'm trying to either place within the literatures that exists on justice, in the transitional justice field, or so basically I think that's the challenge So probably my paper doesn't come out clearly with some of those concepts, but I take that. And what have been the impact of the changes in perceptions of justice on security? Yes, and I also focus a lot about that. It's these security transformations I think we're talking about. Of course, there are tensions on the ground, and as I said, these justice perceptions are changing. If you look at, there's a Kenyan cartoonist, favorite cartoonist called Gado. If you look at some of the cartoons he has drawn over time about even how we think about the ICC. In 2008, after the violence, everybody was saying, oh, let's go to the Hague. I mean, around 2009, let's go to the Hague, let's not be vague. And it became a mantra, very popular. And of course it was elite led. It was led by the elites because they saw ICC justice is going to be neutral, it's better than starting a local trial. And then that changed. Let's not be vague, let's go to the Hague. And is it 2010, when Uhuru and Ruto were indicted, the discourse changed completely, the narrative changed completely. It was, ICC. Everything changed after that. So it changes, and now I fear that because there's a lot of discontent in Rift Valley, and the pact so Ruto's people feel a bit unhappy about certain appointments and that kind of thing. So I would also want to see whether that probably has changed. So it keeps moving. So it's quite fluid. And then Desmond Davis, yes, I agree with you. The challenges of funding that the ICC has. I went to a meeting last month, and I think they were saying that the budget of the ICC is $5 million in the African cases, or was it the Kenyan case? But it was quite a small amount of money, and those are the challenges that you find on the ground in terms of witness identification and protection. And of course, if their resources are that limited, and I'm not speaking for them, it's of course politicians with other agendas. It's very easy to manipulate such a very dynamic local space where there's like a political economy around these spaces. It's almost like business people. When you meet somebody and they'll say, I don't know, of course these are anecdotal evidence, they will tell me, the ICC is giving 300,000, and then they relocate me to some country that is cold. Who is interested? Ruto is giving 1 million. I would rather take Ruto's money and shut up, even though I was a witness. So there's it's like a business running around. It's just interesting. I wish. But that really, yes, I take your point about we should not focus too much on what these people are saying without the context of the ICC, and that needs to. But also, my focus of the research is more, and also speaking to Professor Shoeman's question, and maybe I did not make myself clear. When the PhD research is the perceptions of the ICC, the coping strategies is one part, I think, of the results that I'm getting. And probably, yes, I'm still thinking it could be one chapter within the thesis, or maybe it could emerge as the main topic. But yeah, because there are also like other issues that this is just one of the parts, but thank you for that. So about changing the title. And then Clement, is my selection of respondents representative? Yes, I would say so. I looked at different demographics, so state, class, gender, age, class, class, gender, age, ethnicity, in those counties that I researched in Nakuru, Uasin Gishu, and a bit of Nyeri. But also, I think I get where you're coming from. Since I'm using an interpretivist approach, my objective is really to understand. So it's to understand why, say, these people who we would expect, especially people who are very affected by the violence, the victims, we would expect then so the ICC is on one side, and I met like the outreach officer and reading also a lot of literature on what the ICC said. Why are we going into Kenya? And Ocampo was very clear to end impunity, to protect the victims, and all those. And also it's on their website. And also with my interviews with the outreach officer here in Kenya, and even for them, they are really, really challenged with the Kenyan case. She told me this is the most challenging of all the places they have been. They don't know what to do. So I think that was the background, is to understand how people who then we would expect, oh, the ICC, because of violence and a culture of impunity, they don't quite trust what has been, because it's true, as Wale was saying, every election we've had cyclic violence apart from 2002 when all the elites united, since the advent of multi-party elections in 1992. So yes, so these people are used to cyclic violence, especially in those counties, in Uasin Gishu, Nakuru, and majorly the Rift Valley, because of course, again, a lot of the history on impunity and land, and which I've covered in my paper. So it was looking at that specific dynamic. Then I needed to understand through the people who are mostly the victims and also people who are affected by the violence in those counties, and then also having the president and the deputy president from these two different ethnicities, of people who've been really against each other, and now they are best of friends even at that local level. But again, it's complicated. Then they will always say, yes, this is like a marriage of convenience, and they are very aware it's a fake marriage, as a respondent told me, but they are making the best of that fake marriage and using that stability to get ahead socioeconomically. And those are the things we are saying. They are busy buying land in this new place where the Nakuru, so like in Uasin Gishu, they're busy buying land in Nakuru, which is a more homogeneous place and where Kikuyus look to have more power because of population and economic. So you can see they know it's not working, and they're busy investing elsewhere. And then the coping strategies I presented, or the security transformations I presented, is then now what you see, where now these people are coming to buy land. So when you come in, where do you buy land? You ask people, where are my people? And that's where you go. Wale Isamil, yes, historical dimensions, I have focused on that. It's just that I didn't have enough time looking at what lessons were learned and its issues of impunity, where we are coming from. The concept of ethnicity, and it's true, ethnic identities are very fluid and complex. And the land issue, yes, I agree, it is multi-layered, and I'm alive to those changing dynamics, especially, so there are all so many different levels. There are also, sometimes even those people who are against each other and buying land against each other and kicking each other out of their own zones, sometimes will gang up to kick out the new squad IDPs who have been brought. But even within trying to not really kick out, they use all these strategies either with the leadership, the provincial administration especially, to let them know about their discontent, and they will of course try to subvert the provincial administration resettlement programs in such areas. So yes, that becomes an issue, and sometimes they coalesce. But once their common enemy is over, they're back to how do we get rid of you? And Professor Nasong'o, yes, I take your point. The ICC justice is true. It really favors the accused. So the accused have become the victims, and the victims have become the accused. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for the presenters, Njoki and Dr. Ake. Thank you for very good papers, and I think I take this opportunity now to respectively hand over the podium to Dr. Murunga.
By the way, none of these people was elected. It's a figment of Cyril's imagination that he had been elected. but I thought that the hype should go on for a while. Thank you very much, Eka. Thank you very much, Njoki. Really appreciate those presentations, and Professor Nasong'o, thank you very much.